Welcome to Things You Don't Know. I am here for this episode with our resident historian, Dr. Deneen, and our energizer, Chandler Foster. Look, before we begin this episode, it's important to give a disclaimer. This episode is educational. We are not here to campaign for marijuana use, and we are not here to demonize it. We're here to present facts. We also want to make it clear that we do not support life-changing criminalization of non-dealers and occasional users. That is a statement about proportional punishment, not an endorsement of use. Legally, the starting point is actually fairly simple. Under federal law, marijuana remains a Schedule I drug act under the Controlled Substances Act, or CSA, according to the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. At the same time, state laws vary widely, so the public often hears two different legal messages at once.
Absolutely. And I want to also make something clear too here, Dr. Weaver. We're focusing here strictly on marijuana rather than hashish. Now, pot and hashish, they both come from the cannabis plant, but they're different forms. Pot usually means marijuana, which is the dried flowers, leaves, and small stems of the plant. Hashish, though, it's a more concentrated cannabis product, and it's made from the plant's resin, especially the trichomes, which contain much of the THC. And the main differences here, the first one is the form. Pot is dried plant material, and hashish is compressed resin. Now, the strength, the hashish is usually stronger than the pot because it's more concentrated. Now, the appearance of pot, it's more leafy, but the appearance of hashish, it's usually brown, black, a tan block, ball, or a crumbly piece. Now, both can be smoked or otherwise used, but hashish delivers more cannabinoids in a smaller amount. So, in simpler terms, pot is the plant material, and hashish is the concentrated extract from the plant.
Yeah, pot is not harmless to the lungs. I want to clear that up too. Marijuana smoke contains many of the same toxins, irritants, and carcinogens found in tobacco smoke, and smoking it can damage lung tissue and contribute to chronic bronchitis. The lung cancer link is less settled than it is for tobacco, but it is still there and still a real concern. Now, to be fair, there are other forms of ingestion, including gummies and other things like that.
Dr. Weaver, if I may, that's the perfect place to start. And as we go, let's define our shorthand. THC means tetrahydrocannabinol. That is the main psychoactive chemical in marijuana, the part most associated with intoxication. CBD means cannabidiol. The CDC is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. And IDA is the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And one distinction matters right away. The FDA has not approved marijuana itself as a treatment for disease, even though it has approved one cannabis-derived drug, Epidiolex, and several synthetic cannabis-related drugs for specific conditions.
Now, Dr. Deneen, let me make this practical here. A lot of people here, there are medical uses, and they automatically assume that every marijuana product is medically established. But that's not true. Some people use marijuana for recreation and relaxation. They use it for stress relief, sleep, appetite, pain, or just intoxication. And some report that it helps them, but people use it is not the same thing as every claim about it is strongly proven. That is why this topic can get so emotionally charged very quickly.
Oh, yeah. You're right on target, Chandler. Now let's move to the brain. You knew I was going to do that, right?
Absolutely, Mr. Psychologist.
Neuropsychologist,
Oh,
um, because that is where the discussion gets serious. The CDC says cannabis directly affects brain function, especially the parts involved in memory, learning, attention, decision making, coordination, emotions, and reaction time. And may I add also planning for the future and understanding outcomes. So, even before we get into politics, we have to say this plainly: marijuana is not neurologically neutral. It changes how the brain handles information in the moment.
Dr. Weaver, stay with that for a minute if you would, because one of the most important parts of this is the discussion of the frontal lobe, more specifically the prefrontal cortex. NIDA explains that the prefrontal cortex helps people think, plan, problem solve, make decisions, and assert self control. This matters because when people talk about marijuana, making it harder to think ahead, weigh consequences, stay disciplined, they are not just being moralistic. They are pointing to brain systems that help us organize life around the future rather than the immediate next impulse.
Yes, that is exactly correct, Dr. Deneen. Research reviewed by the CDC and other sources suggests cannabis can affect how the brain builds and uses connections involved in attention, memory, and learning, especially in younger users. Now, not to the exclusion of older users, because connections in the brain, which people don't really understand this, they morph over time, even in a 60-year-old, even in a 70-year-old, just as in a 15-year-old. A little bit slower, but still. In ordinary language, marijuana can interfere with the very circuitry people rely on for judgment and future planning. Future planning. That is why some users become less accurate in assessing consequences. They may not fully register tomorrow's cost because today's relief or pleasure feels more immediate and impactful.
so when somebody says, "Oh, I can still function," yeah, the real question is not just whether they can hold a conversation. The question is whether they are as good at planning, planning, delaying gratification, delaying gratification, reading risk, and making careful, making careful decisions as they think they are. And those are not always the same thing. There's a big difference in what we might think is a good decision versus what really is.
Chandler, you're absolutely right. And that leads naturally into short term effects. In the short run, marijuana may make a person feel relaxed, slowed down, a little amused or detached, but it can also impair reaction time, attention, coordination, memory, and judgment. The CDC is very direct about this in the context of driving. Cannabis can reduce the skills needed for safe driving, including concentration, coordination, and response time. So, I feel okay is not a reliable neurological test.
And that brings us to long term concerns. The CDC says the brain continues developing until about age 25. And cannabis use during adolescence and young adulthood may harm the developing brain. It also warns that when use begins in adolescence, especially if it is regular or heavy, the effects on attention, memory, and learning may last a long time and may even be permanent. That does not mean every young user is doomed. It means the risk is real and is higher when use starts early.
Now, Dr. Weaver, I want to hand you a tougher part of the discussion. I'm talking about drive here. People argue over the phrase a motivational syndrome, but the everyday concern is easy. It's easy to recognize. Is the person losing momentum? Are they less willing to work through boredom? Less disciplined? Less interested in building a future? Less engaged with school, work, or responsibility? And these are all the signs that you can watch out for in a person.
Yeah, that is the right way to frame it. Not every user becomes lazy or aimless. No, no, no. But repeated use can, in some people, weaken initiative and follow through. And when the drug affects systems tied to executive function, impulse control, and future planning, a decline in drive is not hard to understand. A person may begin preferring immediate gratification and comfort over long range effort. Over time, that can quietly reshape a life.
It certainly can. Dr. Weaver, could you connect that to cannabis abuse? Because that is where many listeners probably want the clearest line.
Well, sure. The CDC uses the term cannabis use disorder, or CUD. That means use has crossed from occasional or controlled into something more disruptive. Warning signs include using more than intended, trying and failing to cut down, craving it, spending a lot of time on it, like either using or procuring, giving up important activities, using despite problems at home, work, or school, and continuing even when relationships are being damaged. That is the key distinction. When the drug stops being an occasional behavior and starts reorganizing the person's priorities.
So the dividing line here is not just have you ever used it? The dividing line is it now running more of your life than you are willing to admit?
That's very well put. And now let's widen the lens a bit. Marijuana is not alcohol, but the comparison is useful. The National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, or NIAAA, says alcohol disrupts the brain's communications pathways and impairs areas involved in judgment, memory, balance, and decision making. It also notes that alcohol disrupts prefrontal cortical function tied to executive control and impulse regulation. So the substances are different, but there is a family resemblance here.
Yeah.
Good analogy. Both can compromise the very brain systems people rely on to govern themselves and their lives wisely.
And that brings us to the roaring 20s and prohibition. The history of alcohol prohibition in the United States is a very useful caution and instructive to us. Federal restrictions did reduce drinking at first, but they also fueled illegal markets, bootlegging, speakeasies, and organized crime. In other words, Legal penalties did not erase demand. That does not mean the law does nothing. It means punishment alone usually does not solve a substance use problem. Culture, enforcement, treatment, availability, and public attitudes, they all matter too.
Hey, Dr. Deneen, why don't you take us into the modern world with this? What about decriminalization?
Sure, Chandler. Briefly, the most famous case is Portugal. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized possession of small amounts of drugs for personal use. That did not make trafficking legal. Instead, personal possession cases were shifted from the criminal court into an administrative system. The safest conclusion is not that decriminalization is magic and not that punishment is magic. It is that criminal penalties alone do not determine use patterns. Broader public health responses matter a great deal.
So, the balanced summary is this: marijuana has real short term effects on memory, attention, judgment, coordination, and reaction time. It can affect brain systems involved in executive function and future planning, especially the prefrontal cortex. Repeated or early use raises more serious concerns, including long lasting cognitive effects and cannabis use disorder. Some users also experience a quiet decline in drive, ambition, or follow through. And on the legal side, history suggests that harsh penalties alone do not substantially eliminate use.
Which leaves us with a sober conclusion. Marijuana is neither a harmless toy nor a subject that's best handled by panic. No, it is a psychoactive drug. It's a psychoactive drug. It has real effects on the brain and has real risks and quite serious risks as well for some users, and a legal history that teaches humility.
And humility, ladies and gentlemen, is probably the right note here. The evidence on balance supports caution, clarity, and proportion.
Yeah, this has been Things You Don't Know, where we try to do facts first and slogans second. So, for Dr. Deneen and Chandler Foster, I bid you adieu for this time. Bye.